This is the chart for Clarence Thomas with a supposedly verified time of 9 p.m. This is a time provided by astrologer Frances McAvoy, and the reference says she got it from the Georgia Record Bureau. My problem with this is that the time registered in 1948 at 9 p.m. might not be completely accurate, in that in the 1940s times were not considered particularly important, and so it's possible that Clarence might have been born a little before or a little after, which in many cases doesn't make that much difference. But in this case, as it turns out, because he has 25 degrees Capricorn, we know this time is at least approximately correct, given that during the pandemic years, Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto would have been conjunct these ascendant degrees, or nearly so, and I believe this corresponds very well with a kind of coming out into more personal power. And I would interpret this on the basis of news reports that stated that Thomas had been keeping to himself essentially for many, many years, but then became a lot more outward, more forceful during the last few years. And you can go back to the pandemic with Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter over these degrees. Now, Saturn has moved into Aquarius. Jupiter was in Aquarius last year. It's already in Pisces. However, Pluto still remains near these degrees. And that alone, the Pluto being near the degrees, is enough to correlate with the situation he finds himself in regard to getting in trouble, so to speak. Because he has Pluto conjunct Saturn at birth in the 8th house, which has to be considered quite difficult, especially when you see that Pluto is square the MC-IC axis. This is a public axis, and when planets are connected to it, they become more challenging. It is true that such aspects can also help you toward developing your career. And yet, when that axis, those degrees, are stimulated, you're more likely than not to run into problems, particularly in the sense that you've been doing something incorrect, and then it basically confronts you. And one way we know that these degrees are likely to be pretty close to the 2 degrees, and therefore this time is probably close at minimum, is that back in the Anita Hill days, in the early 1990s, Pluto was in fact transiting through the midheaven degrees, which is a great way to describe what amounted to a bit of a sexual scandal at the time. But Pluto is that all by itself, and it's also in the 8th sign, which doubles down on the theme. Now, where do we find ourselves today? The question is, are these degrees less than 25, exactly at 25, or more than 25? For them to be more than 25, he has to be born later. If they're less, he's born earlier. If they're exactly 25, he's born at 9 p.m. For those who want to see this guy go down and pay for what he's done around the insurrection and his now infamous dissent, and the fact that he's likely implicated in one way or another, for those people it's better if he's born later, in which case we demonstrate that by moving this forward, for example, something like 5 minutes. So now what happens is these degrees are a little more further along, which means that Pluto will continue to affect them longer. And if it happened to be even later, like say 9-10, then even more so, because that would drag it into next year. However, if you want to go with the time that is provided and you say, no, we'll just stick with 9, then it would mean that the time for him to get in serious trouble is probably this year, because by the year's end, Pluto will have made its last station in the vicinity of these degrees, and then it's going to get beyond the ascendant, and then it'll mean he's unlikely to get in trouble. And so, to the extent that one wants some kind of justice, or is expecting the man to resign or some such thing, then either between now and the end of the year, or hope that he's born later. Beyond that, you do see in this chart why he's been sick lately and hospitalized, because you see this Jupiter in the 12th sign, which is the sign of hospitalization, and it's a health area, and Neptune, which in his chart we see at 10 degrees Libra and it squares his Cancer planets. In fact, and Mercury as well. Mercury is ruler of the 6th of health. Neptune squares it. You know this planet is carrying that theme, and it has been in Pisces in the range where it squares the Jupiter, precisely at the time he was hospitalized. Now, that does continue during the rest of the year as well. So his health continues to be challenged during 2022. And the Pluto near the degrees doesn't help health at all because it comes from the 8th, which is a dangerous house. So you've got two planets, Neptune and Pluto, challenging him at the moment. So depending on whether or not he's able to get away with his malfeasance, the next major period he is likely to be challenged in a pretty big way comes after the next election, when Saturn enters Aries, because when Saturn enters Aries, it will then square his Cancer planets, and it comes from the 8th sign at birth. Therefore, it's a difficult planet. For the time being, there are a number of months that he has to get through, during which time he could get in trouble. It's possible, but I'll end by saying that my sense of the Supreme Court in the US is that you pretty much have to do something incredibly egregious to be thrown off the court. The record of bringing justices who have broken rules, it's a record that is pretty thin. And so going on that, one would have to guess that this guy will probably get away with it. And other than damage to his reputation on account of what's happened, probably not much else will happen. And as far as damage to his reputation, he's already a mediocre judge as well as a right-wing lackey, so I don't know what else can be done to his reputation, because basically the right wing likes him and everyone else doesn't. And that's the bottom line.